But Richard Holden joins me, Chairman of the Conservative Party and Conservative MP for North West Durham. Good afternoon to you.
Afternoon, Sheila.
I'm not getting a great deal of joy on the phone lines about this autumn statement. Tell people what you think they should be pleased with.
Well, I think there's two things to see. One is it's quite clear the government is really doubling down on that plan for business investment and growth. And that's about driving up productivity in the economy, which in the long term is the only way that we can deliver higher wages. And that's what the Chancellor was talking about in the first part of the budget, really putting forwards major changes to the economy to help businesses grow right across the country. And one of those big things was the £11 billion a year package there he's had for basically capital investment relief. And that really helps businesses to invest in people, invest in the workforce, and invest in a higher skilled economy. So that's the long-term element.
Sorry, just so people know what you're talking about, is that the full tax relief on substantial investment, not just normal expenses, but big investments?
That's correct. So that basically encourages business to invest in larger capital investments, which basically can help make workers more productive, help upskill workers, that sort of thing. And that's one of the big gaps that we see for the UK. We have to become a more productive country in order to deliver that greater economic growth in the long term. And the other side to that, Sheila, just to answer your first question, was that the other side is, where possible, we want to provide tax relief for people, particularly those in work. So what we've done is we've reduced the amount of national insurance contributions people pay from 12% of their income to 10% of their income. And that will, for somebody, they say the average nurse, will mean over £500 extra a year in their pocket, which is I think is the right thing to do, and it also will help to really push one of the big issues we've got in our country, which is to really reward people in work wherever possible.
You talked about making workers more productive, and obviously that isn't just about they themselves and what they do. It's about the conditions in which they work, including, for example, travel to and from work, including the roads, including trains, including other infrastructure that supports productivity. And yet you've frozen investment on those things in the public sector. That runs alongside the private sector productivity, doesn't it?
I would say a couple of things on that. First of all, most people who travel to work by public transport will travel to work by bus. And one of the things that we've done over the last couple of years, and that's part of what's happening now, is the get around for £2 bus fare outside of London, which has really seen actually a big deflationary pressure on people's travel costs across the country. So that's been particularly targeted at lower paid workers as well, who are more likely to travel by bus. In other areas, though, one of the big things that we did, and you'll know this from the Prime Minister's speech at conference, was obviously move away that investment, which was just going to be purely focused on the Manchester to Birmingham leg of HS2. And that's freed up around £2 billion a year for the next about 18 years.
Well, some of them had been pre-announced and weren't as a result of HS2, but anyway.
No, well, I think I'll just go into that a little bit, Sheila. What happens? There's three stages to any building or development project. One is you get the strategic outline business case. That's the sort of idea. You knock around some thoughts. The second is when you drill into it in a bit more detail. But none of those plans, none of them had gone to final business case approval. And you can have all the plans you want, but unless the cash is there, and that's what that decision on HS2 released the money for lots of projects. In fact, in my previous role as Roads Minister, I announced the first one of those new capital schemes up at Jock's Lodge in East Yorkshire just a few weeks ago. And that been waiting for a long time for that money to come through. So actually releasing that will provide a huge boost to schemes right across the country as well. So I think actually focusing the capital investment where it's going to do the most good for people is what we need to see. And also, we've supported people a lot during the pandemic, and I want to see, wherever possible, that support come in terms of tax cuts, particularly for those in work, to really reward work as well, because I think that's incredibly important. But alongside that, obviously we've seen benefits and pensions properly and fully uprated as well. So pensioners will be seeing an 8.5% increase in their state pensions next year as well. And I think that's an important part of that that package too.
Can I ask you about, still with the thought of productivity in mind, we are a pretty sick nation, aren't we? We have huge waiting lists on the NHS, 7 million or so. We have 5 or 6 million people, quotes, economically inactive. a couple of million at least because of temporary sickness rather than permanent disability and the like.
Yes, that's right.
Why was NHS waiting lists not mentioned in this? And action on health is action on productivity. And yet there was the fleeting mention of health in the Chancellor's announcement around getting people who are on benefits into work. A valid aim in many cases. I mean, some people will not be able to work for pretty obvious reasons, but the central to it is the health of the nation, isn't it?
No, I think you're right on that. Health is an incredibly important
So why didn't
area.
he put a bigger focus on that?
Well, I think what he has done in previous budgets, and obviously he did mention it in the budget today, but we're looking now at record health spending, regardless of whichever party's ever been in power, looking at really huge record health spending, in that sort of 200 billion a year, ballpark now in terms of health spending in the UK. That has been a massive focus. One of the things that we've been looking at as well, and he focused a lot of this. In fact, he did mention it, and this was, I think, one of the big things that he focused on as Health Secretary and as Chancellor.
But there were 10 years
well
of cuts to health spending. Just forgive me. There were 10 years of cuts to health spending.
That's not true. That's just not true. That is just
from the point at which Labour were in power, the way that spending in the NHS. I mean, you may think this was wasteful spending. You can tell me if you think so.
No,
it was going up and then started to tail off and has gone down.
No, that's just not true. Health spending has gone up significantly
the amount,
in real terms.
Yes, okay, I get what you're saying.
In real terms, it really has gone up in real terms. I think what you're saying is the rises weren't as rapid as they had been previously.
They weren't as full. They weren't as big. Which is why there were cuts to hospital budgets. There have been no cuts to the health service.
The health service has not been cut since it really hasn't. If you look at those numbers, I will tell you, I will post on Twitter the NHS budgets for the last 13 years, so you can see both in real terms and in cash terms what we've actually delivered. Because I think it's really important to be clear about that. We are seeing greater demands. I think that's one of the things. We've got an ageing population. Obviously, there are new drugs and things like that which come on, which are expensive and we do need to pay for. But no, there has been a real terms increase in the NHS budget.
And I'll come back to you on it another time.
I will. I just wanted to mention, though, the one thing he really concentrated on was that long-term NHS workforce plan. And that is something which I think is incredibly important. It's the first time in the NHS's history since it was founded in the 1940s that we're going to have that workforce plan. And that's going to see basically an increase of over 2/3 in the numbers of doctors being trained. We've already seen record numbers of nurses and doctors in the NHS, and we need to get that pipeline through. One of the things we'd historically done as a country actually is probably rely too much on taking doctors and nurses from other countries in, and actually we need to train more of them ourselves. And getting that long-term plan for the NHS workforce right is a really important part of that as well. One of the things I think has probably not been mentioned as much in the wash-up from the budget so far has been around those big changes we're actually making to pension schemes as well. We've got around 30,000 pension schemes across the country at the moment. Over time, we want to see those consolidated into a smaller number, probably around 1,000 of them. That will reduce fees within them. It also means that they're stronger individually as well. So in the long term for people, that will also mean two things. One, it means those pension companies will be able to invest in new, smaller businesses in the UK. One of the big problems where we see some of our good new entrepreneurs in the UK then move to America to get funding is because those smaller pension funds cannot take that level of risk appetite that a much larger fund could as part of a really balanced portfolio. So that'll be really helpful there. And with the reduction in numbers of funds, we'll also see probably around up to £1,000 a year extra for people when they're paying into their pensions at the end of their lives as well in their private pensions. So I think that's a big long-term reform as well, which is something I think we've needed for some time.
The OBR today is painting, the Office of Budget Responsibility is painting something of a sorry picture of the next decade even. We've got house prices falling, again, good for some, bad for others, house prices falling, inflation, yes, falling, but continuing for longer than they expected at these middle rates. So that means prices will still be going up, less acutely, but still going up. And that will be felt very much by the poorest. And they talk about the level of growth, which, again, the Chancellor was framing in a very particular way. They frame it rather differently and rather more negatively. How does the Conservative Party have a hope after 13 years of convincing people that their money, the economy, their future, their thriving is safe in your hands when it comes to the next election?
Well, what I'd say on the economy is that first of all, let's look at what the OBR's overall picture was, and that is that growth will be higher overall over the period than it was in its previous prediction. But I think one of the key things as well is let's look back what's happened over the last year or so, and that we were told by a lot of the international organisations, the IMF, the OECD, all these acronyms that people talk about, that the UK economy were going to recession. Actually, we've overperformed, significantly overperformed that, and we've done that over a number of years now. A number of predictions we've overperformed, but even in their predictions going forwards, the OBR's predictions over the term, we'll actually see higher growth than we'd had previously. But that's why those big reforms that I talked about in terms of that long-term plan, those real changes in how we encourage business to invest for the long term, those are really important, because the only way we're going to drive productivity over the longer term is by making those changes that the Chancellor announced today. That's 110 individual changes, but some of them, like the one on being able to write down capital investment, is incredibly important to that plan. Another was around how we ensure that we have one of the best schemes in the world to get external investors into the UK as well. So I think those are really important. And so I think you're whether it's personal taxation, whether that's for the self-employed people, we've seen a reduction there in self-employed tax in terms of national insurance, or whether it's people in work, we've seen a reduction there, whether it's pensioners who are seeing a good rise, and whether it's that long-term plan. I think on all areas, the Chancellor's really laid out a positive package for the country today. I think there's, it's so important that when we're looking at the economy, we do take proper long-term decisions, because we know what happens if you don't. We saw it when we came into office. And one of those interesting things announced today as well was the fact that he's going to look at that final NatWest share sale. It was that financial crisis back in 2008, and after Gordon Brown said he'd abolished boom and bust, that meant we had to nationalise.
You're not blaming Gordon Brown for everything, are you? Are you really? I'm
not blaming him for everything. I mean,
not everything.
Not responsible for war in the Middle East.
But
he is. Yeah. But it was very, that when we nationalised.
Oh, you're making yourself look silly now. Come on, bringing Gordon Brown into this.
No, just. Sheila, I mean, this is a really important point. You might have missed this from the budget, but we're going to sell the NatWest. That was bought at the height of the financial crisis back in 2008, and it's some of those unwindings that have taken a very long time for us to do. And I think it's really important that we get those companies eventually, now, as long as the conditions are there, right off the government's balance sheet as well, because that's what we've got to do in the long-term
and
interest
pour
of
it
the
into
country.
public services, I hope. Thank Richard Holden. I have to leave it there.
No problem. Thank you so much for your time, Sheila.
Right,
and I'll give you a tweet later on.
I look forward to that tweet, and I hope you will take a quick look at the King's Fund and the National Audit Office, the government's own spending watchdog, for what's happened to the NHS in the last 10 years. But thank you very much indeed for joining me. Richard Holden, Chairman of the Conservative Party and Conservative MP for North West Durham.